Good afternoon, everybody. Thank you so much for being here for this, what I know will be an amazing masterclass by Alexis Gambis. Alexis is our 2021 filmmaker in residence. And this is part of the 30th Woods Hole Film Festival. About 10 years ago, we started a program to invite filmmakers who have a body of work that has been recognized by their peers as for its creative value, to come to the festival, show their work, offer a masterclass, and participate in panel discussions, in part to help the other filmmakers who are part of the festival, but also to be able to give them an opportunity to go deeper into what they do. It takes many years to create a body of work, and often we look at things one film at a time, but being able to look at somebody's filmmaking career from the perspective of time really, I think, gives a much broader understanding of why somebody does what they do and the connection between the stories that they've chosen to tell. So we invited Alexis here because we have a film and science initiative. And Woods Hole, for those of you who may not know, is a place that has many scientific institutions right in our little village. The Woods Hole Oceanographic Institution, the Marine Biological Laboratory, the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration, the U.S. Geological Survey. We are surrounded by science and ocean science, and we have, for many years, shown films that have a connection to the science that is being done in this community. And about 10 years ago, we started thinking about how to provide opportunities for filmmakers to connect with scientists. And around 5 years ago, we turned that into a very structured initiative. We call it our Film and Science Initiative. And the purpose of that is to bring together filmmakers and scientists to make better films about science. In this day and age, the way that people consume information and their media is very visual. And so we know that there's a great opportunity for these stories to be told through this visual medium. So Alexis has also been working at the forefront of this independently and on his own, and he's going to talk about that for about the next hour. So the process for this masterclass is he's going to talk for about 45 minutes, and then we'll open it up for Q&A. I will say that we have many great films at the festival this year, Son of Monarchs being one of them, which is very exciting. It will come out theatrically sometime in the fall. I'm sure he'll tell us more about that. But when we open it up for Q&A, please type your questions in the Q&A in the chat, and we'll get to them as quickly as we can. So without further ado, let's turn the mic and the stage over to Alexis. Thank you so much for being here.
Thank you. Thank you, Judy, for having me. I can hear my voice there. It's like double voice, but I think I'm good. Yeah, thank you so much, Judy, and thank you to everybody at the Woods Hole Film Festival for having me and for having me as the filmmaker in residence this year. I'm going to talk a little bit today about my work, and I'm sad that I can't be there in person with everyone. It's been a long time since we've all been virtual, and unfortunately I wasn't able to come to Woods Hole. But I'm going to talk a little bit today about my work. It's always exciting to also, think about your own work and kind of put it into perspective and think about how all of the pieces connect with each other. And I'll tell everybody a little bit about, my work as a filmmaker, as a science filmmaker, a little bit about my background as a biologist before getting into film. But also one of my other hats is I also run a film festival in New York called the Imagine Science Film Festival. And I also started a platform called Labo Cine, which is sort of like a Netflix for science platform that I started a few years ago. So I'm really interested in not only thinking about how to incorporate science into film in my own work, but also the curatorial aspect of what I do. And I'll give a little presentation, kind of a formal presentation about my work. And the title today is The Science New Wave, and I'll talk a little bit about what that means. But it's sort of an umbrella that encompasses everything that I do, and I'll talk a little bit about what that means and how I think about the work that I do. Before getting started, let me tell everybody a little bit about myself. I am French Venezuelan, but I've been living in New York for quite some time. I started out as a biologist. Actually, both my parents are artists. My dad's a painter, and my mom's a filmmaker. And somehow I got into biology. My field of research was cancer biology, but I was mostly studying fruit flies for many years, and that connects me a little bit to Woods Hole because there was a lot of the people that worked in New York on flies would come to Woods Hole in the summers and bring their fruit flies because it was too hot to work in the laboratories in New York City. And so I did a PhD in molecular biology. And throughout my PhD, I started becoming really interested in visual storytelling, very interested in microscopy and telling stories around the science that I was doing through film. And I started becoming really interested in making short films, mostly fiction work. I was really interested in this idea of how to incorporate science into storytelling, but also how to incorporate science into magical realism and reimagining the lab as a space of magic and not only factual, but a place where we could kind of create our own worlds. And that's a little bit how I got into film. And after getting my PhD, I then went to NYU Film School, and I did a NYU. And as my thesis film, my first film was actually based on my research. It was called The Fly Room, and it was about the birthplace of genetics in New York in the 1920s, a laboratory called The Fly Room. That's a little bit about my background. And today I make films. I also teach at New York University, and I also run a festival. And those are kind of the three things that I do. I curate, I teach, and I make films. And I think a lot about how to distribute my own work through my own platforms, and thinking about film distribution is something that is continuously on my mind. So I'm going to share a presentation and talk a little bit about the science new wave, talk a little bit about what that means, then get into some of the work, including Son of Monarchs, that is playing at the festival. And talk a little bit about my initiatives, and then afterwards, if anybody has any questions, feel free to to leave one in the chat box, or I believe you can also raise your hand and come in, which will be even better, so that I can hear people. So let me share my screen here. Here we go. So today I'm going to talk a little bit about the science new wave, and really kind of define what I mean by that. And just to give a little bit of backstory about the work that I do, my work is considered to be at the intersection of science and film. But I found that intersection to be sort of blurry, and a lot of people didn't really understand fully what it meant to make science films, or to be both a biologist and a filmmaker. So a few years ago, we decided to start a movement, a little bit in the spirit of the French New Wave and other movements that have started in cinema, where we would formalize what the films that I was making, but also the films that I started at the festival that I was organizing, and things that were particularly important to us, and how science was to be translated into cinema. And I'm going to talk a little bit about that today. And before that, the idea is really, with the work that I do, and also the curatorial, the programming that we do at Imagine Science, my festival, is to find new ways in which we can think about how to bring science into film. Now, one aspect is, how do you incorporate science into narrative work, into different types of filmmaking? But the other aspect is also, how do we incorporate the individual scientist into the process of making films, so that it's not only about scientists being advisors or mentors, but integrally involved in the process of making films, from the part of acting, production design, producing films, so that it becomes almost a very integral collaborations between scientists and filmmakers. And I want to take these two sort of definitions. One of them, and take these definitions and adapt them into this kind of context of what I mean by the science new wave. For one, it's a movement where we're trying to reimagine, but also formalize how science is brought into film. And in the spirit of the avant-garde cinema, the idea is to have both filmmakers and, in this case, scientists be able to express their thoughts in, however way they want to do it, whether it be very abstract or a little bit more formal, and find ways in which they can translate, their obsessions, but also their research in different forms. Of course, in avant-garde cinema, we talk about, them kind of translating that into potentially installation, or potentially into non-narrative work or abstract work. But the idea with avant-garde cinema is to be very free in the form, in the way in which we actually allow, whether you're a filmmaker or a scientist, we allow them to really freely express themselves through visual storytelling. And in some ways, by doing this, we come back to the birth of cinema. The birth of cinema in the early 20th century was all about using the instruments, the cinematography, the actual camera, as a device where we could do both factual recording, but also think about illusion and magic, with Georges Méliès, and be very open in how we can use the camera to freely express scientific thoughts. And so I like to think of the science new wave as an homage, as a tribute to early cinema. And in a way, we talk a lot about bridging arts and science and bridging science and film, but in some ways, it's also kind of coming back to the original source of what science and film are actually coming from the same entity to some extent. And of course, the other spin-off of science new wave is the idea of kind of being inspired by the French new wave. And one of the big principles of the French new wave was to speak about social issues, and also think about radical experimentation, where scientists, filmmakers, economists, anthropologists would all come together and really think about, what were the ways in which we would speak about social issues of our time, and also shoot on location, but really a conversation between many people in different professions. And so we can also think of science as being an extension to that, where in order to make good science films, we need to not only think about this idea of experimenting with form, but it has to be collaborative, meaning that scientists, filmmakers, anthropologists, all of these titles and professions have to be blurred to some extent so that there's a symbiosis between all of them. So those are some of the other movements and manifestos that we were inspired by when we started the Science New Wave. And a few years ago, exactly 5 years ago, I came up with this term, Science New Wave, with friends that were scientists, but also filmmakers and artists, and we kind of devised this concept. And we decided that instead of thinking about the science new wave, or instead of thinking about it as having principles or rules, we would sort of be inspired by biological ideas. So we thought it would be an interesting idea to think of the science new wave as having traits, thinking of it almost as like an organism, that it has like specific traits that we want to adhere to when we make our films. And so I'm going to go through this a little bit now. One of them is, and these may seem quite simple, but it's sometimes important to state it, is to remind ourselves that science and science filmmaking is not niche. Science is part of our everyday lives, and science is culture, and these two words are also interchangeable. Culture is science. And something that is very important about this trait is remembering that there are many different ways in which science has a universality to it, the way we actually conduct science, the scientific process, but culture can also inform how we do science. And so it's important to really appreciate the kind of the cultural dimensions of science and vice versa. And as kind of a side note, it's interesting to think also, when you actually do research, you often talk about culturing cells. Like when we're actually looking at cells under the microscope, we talk about that as like as cell culture, for example. So it's an interesting also use of the word culture in a scientific context. The other critical concept of the science new wave is this idea that diversity feeds the ecosystem. And again, we're taking these biological principles and we're extrapolating them and translating them into a cinematic context. And this is critical in the sense that, you know, when we're making films, we always have to think about diversity, not only diversity in, you know, biological entities that are being that are expressing themselves on screen, but also in representation and voices, but also diversity in terms of form. You know, that it doesn't necessarily have to be documentary or fiction, but you can hybridize different forms together, and it's really important to always think about this aspect of diversity and how we do things. And diversity is not only a mandate, it's not only something that is critical, but it also enriches the films that we make. And of course, in a biological context, it feeds the ecosystem, it makes the ecosystem more healthy and more vibrant. Another trait that is really critical to a lot of the work Become Cinema is this idea that, you know, scientific data, and I'll talk a little bit more about this afterwards, scientific data is also cinematic. We may sometimes consider that scientific data needs to be packaged, needs to have voiceover, needs to be embedded in a different context, but we need to make sure that we also give value to the actual data, you know, and whether it's experiments that are happening in the lab, whether it's field work, the experiment in itself, in its kind of purest form, you know, recording something under the microscope, doing field research, doing simulations, that also has cinematic value. And of course, nowadays, we record a lot of our experiments. We use cameras and we use different types of animation, and we need to remember that experiments are also cinema. And we may want to include voiceover and we may want to explain things, but we may also not want to do that. We may want to just show an experiment and have people appreciate it for its aesthetic value, and not necessarily have to over-explain everything that we show on screen. And this is something that is really important in my own work. I oftentimes show a lot of scientific data on screen, and I embed it into a larger narrative where, you know, it has meaning about the characters and the story that I tell, but I don't necessarily have to explain what people are watching when they see those experiments. Another trait is this idea that structure dictates function. And this is, again, a biological principle, and it's a very important one when we're speaking, for example, about molecules or proteins or cells. Even when we're speaking in this context about viruses, for example, with COVID, we often don't fully understand what, you know, whatever scale we're looking at. If we're looking at a protein, we don't fully understand what the function of those proteins are. And a lot of the information of what the function is, or what the functions are of these different structures, is informed by the structure. You know, so for example, hemoglobin, we know that it has, you know, a specific role in carrying oxygen because of the structure that it has. And if we extrapolate that into a cinematic context, and this is critical in the work that we do, where if you decide to make a documentary, if you decide to make fiction or an animation, it's because it has a specific function, it has a specific target audience, a specific reach, a specific meaning to you in terms of what you're trying to say. And oftentimes, especially with science cinema, sometimes we think about structure without necessarily thinking about its function. We may say, like, oh, I want to make a science documentary. I want to make something that's episodic. But it's critical to always think about what is the function, what is it that you're trying to say, and who is the reach before you decide on that structure. The other thing that's really important is that structure is very malleable. Same, again, thinking about it as like a biological entity, it can change. You know, you don't have to stick to one structure. You can have multiple structures in a film. You can go from something that's maybe a bit more experimental to fiction, to documentary, and you shouldn't be afraid of hybridizing all of these forms together to tell the stories that you want to tell. And of course, this brings me to the story aspect, which is something that is important to emphasize. And I think we've been more and more aware of this, especially as people have been brainstorming recently about, you know, the intersection of science and film, especially at the Woods Hole Film Festival, is that yes, science is factual. Science does have, you know, and science filmmaking does have this ability of of informing people, being pedagogic. But at the same time, it's very important to remind ourselves that storytelling, the ability to tell stories, to be lyrical, to be, to imagine stories, is not necessarily in opposition to the science. That you can take science and story, and those can complement each other. And oftentimes when I speak about my work and I tell people, oh, I make science in fiction, I incorporate science into fiction, people don't fully understand how those two words coexist with each other. They think, oh, do you make science fiction? Are you extrapolating? No, it's like, no, the science is accurate, but there's also a very kind of deep appreciation and adherence to storytelling and to a narrative framework. And the last trait is, and this is a critical one, is that when we make the films and we tell the stories that we make, everybody has a message. And sometimes when we think of science documentaries, we oftentimes have scientists on screen talking about a specific aspect of research. But every single entity, whether it be a scientist, an artist, a filmmaker, also thinking about it at different scales, whether it's a human being or an animal, whether it's a molecule like DNA. Of course, DNA has a message because that is the goal of DNA. Or if you're thinking about neurons that connect messages in the brain and send signals, they also have a message to democratize who's actually telling these stories, that everybody has the ability to tell a science story. And it's not only relegated to scientists, but everybody should be able to do it, including artists. And so these are some of the principles or the traits that we like to think of when we're thinking about the Science New Wave. And I'll come back to the Science New Wave towards the end of my presentation, but it definitely helps formalize, or it helps when I talk about my work to have this umbrella, so people can also not only think about how this relates to their own work, but also think about, how could I possibly join the Science New Wave, or how could I also think about my work in this context? And I think it definitely helps formalize kind of this intersection between science and film. And it's also important to understand that it's only one proposal on how science and film can come together. And this brings me to another important aspect, which is science filmmaking is quite broad. There's many different types of science filmmaking. Some of it that's shown at the Woods Hole Film Festival and other types of festivals. And it's important to take a minute and outline all the different types of science filmmaking, because oftentimes people will create almost like a funnel, and they'll say like, oh no, science filmmaking is what we see on these specific channels, or it's science documentary, or it's science fiction. But there's many different ways, and I like to refer to it again in this kind of context of traits. There are many traits to science filmmaking. There's science documentaries like news reports, nature shows, of course, talking heads, episodic work. There's science fiction, which can go, into kind of the apocalyptic, the futuristic, the dystopian. It can also kind of be at the borderline between factual science. You can play with magical realism, and I like to oftentimes refer to this as not necessarily science fiction, but avant-garde science, where you're still talking about science that is happening today, but you're bringing in this kind of dreamlike qualities. And this is where my work personally fits in, is kind of in this realm of magical realism and allegorical science. And as I mentioned before, there's also all of the the work that is done, controlled experiments, early cinema, observational cinema, trying to understand anatomy or trying to understand how things develop under the microscope. These are all kind of in the realm of experiments. And of course, there are many different fusions between these different forms that I like to refer to as hybrids. And so with that, I wanted to talk a little bit, before I get into my own work, I wanted to talk a little bit about my background. When I started making, or when I was interested in bringing together science and film, the first thing that I decided to do was to create an organization where I would start curating work from other people, because I wanted to create almost a community where I could bring people together. And I realized that there were many scientists that were interested in film, many filmmakers that wanted to dabble into science. And so because I wasn't seeing it in the ecosystem that was out there, I decided to start my own festival with mostly scientists. None of us had none of us had a film background, and we had no idea how to run a film festival. But I remember this was 15 years ago, we were all PhD and postdocs, and we came together and we said, what if we were to start our own festival where we would, encourage this collaboration between scientists and filmmakers and show people the many ways in which science can be communicated into film. And so this festival morphed in 2008 into the Imagine Science Film Festival, which is now in its 14th year. It happens in New York, but it also happens in many other cities. But the annual festival happens in New York in the fall. And after the Woods Hole Film Festival, I invite everybody to come to New York in the fall. It happens this year from October 15th to the 22nd. And these are some of the traits, again, of the festival. One of them is to always remember that we are imagining science, to be creative on how we bring science into film, whether it be documentary, fiction, music video, art films. But another big aspect of the festival is to diversify the types of venues. So not only show it in cinemas, but also in museums and universities and bars, sometimes in laboratories. And this is what's great about the Imagine Science Film Festival, is that we're sort of a traveling circus, and we go to many different places around the city where we reach different types of audiences, and we show different types of films. And the way the festival happens is that our films are never curated based on form. It's always based on a theme. So we may be speaking about immortality, or maybe speaking about climate change. And within those programs, we'll have documentary, we'll have fiction, we'll have installation work. And we want people to appreciate these many different ways in which you can express science and into these different forms. The festival has now morphed into having artist in residence program. We also have this thing called the Imagine Science Lab, where we're really interested in exploring these collaborations between scientists and filmmakers, which I'll talk a little bit about. We have outreach, where we organize satellite festivals in different countries, and we also partner with museums and other institutions around the world. We created this Imagine Scope, which is a microscope where you look through microscopes and you can actually watch films. So it teaches people how to use microscopes, but also the cinematic value of looking, almost like early cinema, where you would look through almost like a peephole, and like the Nickelodeons, and we've kind of established the Imagine Scope for schools and for kids especially that were interested in learning about how to use microscopes, but also watch movies. And another initiative that we have is called Scenes, where we're trying to create a very large database of scientific data, visual scientific data, moving images that people can actually access and use in their films, and almost like a Shutterstock, but of actual scientific data that is done around the world. Another big part of the festival, which is in the context of the Imagine Science Lab, and I invite everybody out there that is listening, whether you're a filmmaker, a producer, a scientist, to apply. It's called Symbiosis, where we bring together scientists and filmmakers over the course of the festival that goes on for 8 days, and they make films together. They meet on the first day. Midway through the competition, they have to do something called the Symbiosis Lab meeting, where they go up on stage. Let's say you have a plant biologist and a filmmaker that makes like horror movies, and they go up on stage and they're like, okay, we want to make a plant horror movie. We just met a few days ago. I do animation. She does plant microscopy, and we're brainstorming on how to make a film together. And what's really important about this competition that is presented by the Simons Foundation and an entity of the Simons Foundation called the Science Sandbox, is that both the scientists and the filmmakers equally contribute to the making of these films. You're never in a situation, again, back to the traits, you're never in a situation where the scientists are advising the filmmakers, but they're both equally creating these films together, and that's really important, integral part of the Symbiosis competition. And we've been doing this for many years now, 8 years of this, and these films have then gone on to play at other festivals, and it's been a wonderful kind of lifelong kind of collaborations that have come out of these. And a few other things that I wanted to mention before kind of jumping into my own work, but things that I think a lot about when I make my own films, and I'm kind of going to enter into my own work from the festival, is, how do we make stories around science? And one of the things that I think a lot about is this idea of the scientific process. The nature of doing science is so fascinating, to actually observe somebody in a laboratory or on the field actually doing science, that I think there needs to be more emphasis on that in film, because oftentimes when we watch science films, it's always about the end result or the discovery, but it's never about the kind of the beauty and the music, because there's something, it's almost like playing an instrument. Just observing people actually working in the lab is really amazing, and I think that we need to see more of that. Thinking of also how scientific challenges can complement story plots, so also thinking about how a question that we have in science can also complement, a personal issue or personal tragedy or romance. Like we may be looking at in the case of Son of Monarchs, my film about butterflies, we may be looking at a butterfly going through metamorphosis, and it's also in parallel to a young man going through a relationship, for example. The other thing is really prioritizing this idea of scientific observation, like what we see under the microscope, and giving value to that. So a lot of times in my own work, I show what's happening under the microscope. I show a developing wing, or I show something crawling under the microscope, and really giving value to that, and never forgetting that the research is engaging and can also be used as a way to dramatize the work. And the lab is really interesting, whether it's a scientific lab, whether it's a field research center. It's almost like a film studio. Use everything in that space in your films. All of the props, the instruments, they're all just amazing tools, and thinking of it almost as a film stage or a film studio. And lastly, this idea that the scientist is sort of your hero, and thinking about the scientist as being a human being that is not only somebody that does science, but also has a life next to it, and really just making sure that you humanize the scientist and you make them feel relatable and people that you can actually relate to. And oftentimes we see way too many stereotypes in the representations of scientists on film. I'll come back to Son of Monarchs, the film that's playing at the Woods Hole Film Festival, but that's a case of a Mexican scientist that we don't often see in film, and it's a Mexican evolutionary biologist, that's kind of struggling with where he belongs and where he lives, and going through kind of issues with his brother. But he's our modern hero in the film. So anyway, I spoke a little bit about this, but I wanted to also kind of talk a little bit about this idea also with scenes, is to give value to experimental data, and again, using scientific data as kind of a stepping platform to think about how we make our films, and not only a laboratory for science, but also a laboratory for film. So this brings me to the next part of my talk, which is, in addition to Imagine Science, I also was interested in my own work in thinking about how to bring the curatorial work that I did also into a platform, because obviously right now, especially now with everything that's happening virtual, there are things that platforms allow you to do that you can't do with physical events. For example, you can show work that is maybe longer. You can also, you can just be very kind of free in terms of how you express this relationship between science and film. And so this platform that we refer to as the Cinema from the Science New Wave is a platform that, and I'll kind of walk you through as I show you this small video, is a platform that works as a video magazine. So every month we have a theme, so right now the theme is about the aesthetics of trash, and thinking about how we think about trash in our world, and also thinking about the repercussions of having so much trash in our world. The August issue that we're going to have that's going to be released on Tuesday is about spirits in the forest. Think about, how we think about our forests. So every month we have an issue, but the platform also has editorial write-ups. We also have a live cinema platform where we show films every month, and there's a calendar where you can actually see the films that we're showing. And similar to the spirit of Imagine Science, when we have an issue, we show documentary, fiction, animation, and it's kind of an amazing platform that kind of shows the diversity in the ecosystem of science cinema. So I encourage everybody to visit the platform and also see all of these works that are made by scientists, by filmmakers, by artists from around the world. And so it's kind of this extension to the film festival that we organize. So this brings me, and then I'll sort of end on this and talking a little bit about my own work, and then circling back to the science new wave. I don't know how I'm doing with time. I think I'm okay so far, but I'll talk a little bit about my work and then open it up to questions. But so I was a PhD student that worked on fruit flies, and when I was in my midway through my PhD, I became really interested in this laboratory called the Fly Room, which is a lab where they discovered basically the gene. The gene was discovered in the Fly Room, which was a lab at Columbia University. And I decided that I was going to make, again, back to this kind of avant-garde definition, I was obsessed with this idea of making this into a film, but I didn't really know how I wanted to tell the story. And in the process of doing research about the Fly Room, I met one of the daughters of the scientist that worked in the Fly Room in the 1920s, and she was 95 years old, and I spent a few years interviewing her. And in one of the visits that I had with her, she was living in Asheville, in North Carolina. She told me that when she was 10 years old, she spent a day with her father in the Fly Room, and this was the first time that she actually spent time with her father at all, because her father was quite estranged, and this was the first time that they spent time together. And her father taught her about genetics, because he's, literally the father of genetics. He was part of the Nobel Prize that received the first Nobel Prize in genetics for the discovery of the gene, and that we have genetic units on our chromosomes. But The Fly Room is a film about a little girl that spends a day with her father and discovers his life, discovers some of his secrets, and tries to kind of reconcile this relationship that she has with her father over the course of one day. And this film, because it was my first feature film, and it was very hard to recreate New York City in the 1920s, most of it was in one room that we recreated. We recreated the Fly Room based on photographs. And we shot a bit of it also at Columbia University, and most of it happens in the Fly Room, and between the father and this girl. Her name is Betsy. So I encourage everybody to watch it. This was my first film that I finished in 2014, and just to kind of give you kind of a backstory, I was working on fruit flies at Rockefeller University. Most of my work was on the visual system of fruit flies, and I started having these kind of, again, these dreams of becoming a fly, and kind of thinking about flies as a metaphor for my own journey. I started making these short films, and this is how I started becoming interested in making more films, partly because of the microscopy, because I was so interested in imaging the fruit flies and seeing them under the microscope, but also this idea of, the animal, insect, as a way of speaking about relationships and other things. And so this was a little bit my foray into making films. The film was on Hulu for a while. I think now you can watch it on Amazon, and it's available, and I can also accommodate anybody that wants to watch it now. But that was my first feature film, and it was also my thesis film when I was a student at New York University. But it was sort of full circle with my research and also my years as a film student. And now I wanted to talk a little bit about Son of Monarchs as kind of the last part of my presentation. This is a film that I shot over the last few years. We luckily were able to shoot before the pandemic. And this is the film that's also playing right now at the Woods Hole Film Festival. And there's a physical screening that just happened. I actually haven't even been able to watch the film in person yet, so because everything has been virtual. The film premiered in Mexico at this festival called Morelia, which is near where we shot in Mexico. And then it went on to play at Sundance Film Festival, where we won the Sloan Prize for the best science film. And the film will then go on to be on HBO in the fall. It'll have a theatrical release in mid-October in different cities around the U.S. and then it'll play on HBO Max on November 2nd. But the story of Son of Monarchs is it's basically the story of a Mexican biologist that lives in New York that decides to return to his hometown in Mexico when his grandmother passes away, and this return back home sparks, trauma that he has with his existing home. He has conflicts with his brother. He has childhood trauma. And this return back home sparks almost like a metamorphosis, an existential crisis. And to keep it suspenseful, he sort of turns into somewhat of a monarch butterfly throughout the film, both emotionally but also physically. And he starts identifying with the monarch butterfly because the biologist works on butterflies in New York, and he also grew up surrounded by butterflies in Mexico. So the butterfly is the link basically between his home in Mexico and his new home in New York City. And again, when I make films, I'm oftentimes inspired by scientific imagery and just observing things under the microscope. It helps me in the writing process, just to observe things that are happening. This is a butterfly pupa. It actually comes from Nipam Patel, who is the head of the marine biology laboratory. And this is the work that he did at UC Berkeley with a few of his postdocs. Here is pupa, where they slice basically part of the pupal case, the chrysalis. They slice it open a little bit so that it almost becomes like a cinematic. It's almost like watching it as if you're watching like a screen. And what you're watching right now is the development of a wing, not in real time, in time lapse, but you're watching a wing being created. And you'll see right now that the veins are starting to form. And then right at the very end of this video, suddenly you're going to start seeing all of the pigments that's going to start developing on the wing. And of course, different butterflies have different colors, and some of them have eye spots. But this was one of the first images that I saw when I was developing the script, and it really inspired me to think of the monarch butterfly as a metaphor, and it's just absolutely beautiful. And these are videos that are done by Nipam and his group, and again, it's a testimony to how scientists are filmmakers as well, and they're thinking about their work in a visual way. And when they're actually doing experiments, they're also thinking about staging it, as if it was like a film studio, but almost like tabletop filmmaking. And it's really important to recognize that scientists are amazing filmmakers. And so with that, I started becoming interested in the monarch butterfly, because the monarch butterfly migrates from Canada through the US and arrives in Mexico. And I thought that was a really interesting way to connect this idea, this story about not only about migration, but also about immigration. What does it mean to migrate when you're a human being versus a butterfly? And so I started looking at these maps and thinking a lot about, what would the world be like if you were a monarch butterfly? Of course, one of the things to remember is that if you're a monarch butterfly, you don't have to necessarily think about borders or about walls, about policy. You are affected, obviously, by climate change and deforestation. All of these things are affecting the monarch butterfly in serious ways, but there's also a certain freedom to being a monarch butterfly and thinking about that and kind of creating the parallel with human beings. So I just wanted to show you a few images. Before shooting the feature film, I went over to Mexico in these amazing sanctuaries. These are butterfly forests. And I started making a few short films to just experiment with, what does it mean to make films in these areas where the monarch butterflies arrive. And I made a few short films where I'm experimenting with either documentary work or fiction work. And I made one short film that I made was about two butterflies that are clowns that are featured here, that are the last two butterflies on the planet. And they're basically traveling through the forest, and it's a story about two last butterflies that are basically, trying to survive in a world where we're trying to cope with climate change and deforestation. And what's beautiful about doing research, but also making short films, is that it allows me to experiment with the form before I embark on making a feature film, which is much more much more ambitious. And of course, you have to deal with budgets and production and all of these things. And so I started becoming, again, interested in the butterfly. It represents also the souls of the dead in Mexico. A lot of people in Mexico in these areas believe that the butterflies bring back the ancestors because they arrive during the Day of the Dead. There's also the whole conservation aspect, people that are tagging the butterflies to understand their migration. And then there's my quirky films that I make that are kind of embedded into these things. And as I mentioned before, I'm really fascinated by shooting, dramatizing the science, the laboratory, either with these macro shots. And if you watch the film, the first shot is literally inspired by that dissection that you saw at the beginning from the Palms lab. That's the opening shot of the film. And you see this man that's looking through the microscope. And this is how I kind of bring you into the story. And these are some of the stills of the film, but it's just so beautiful. The laboratory as a set, everything here was done with scientists helping and collaborating, and it's really important to have, not only credible bench spaces, but also thinking of it as a very kind of lyrical and dreamy space where, scientists can sometimes get lost and meditate, think about their lives. And I think it's a really beautiful space that merits a little bit more kind of richness in how we see it in films. This was shot at NYU. And then, a lot of the work that I do is filming through microscopes. So this is, some of the setups that I do when I film through microscopes. This is a butterfly wing, almost at the atomic scale. You can almost see these these specific scales of different colors, and it's just absolutely beautiful to think of these things under the microscope. This is with electron microscope, so this is high magnification where you're no longer using light, but you're using electrons, so you can actually not even see color. But look how beautiful. These are actual scales of a wing. It's almost like fish scales. And you can even go even deeper. And just looking at these structures and thinking about how to make films around this is absolutely amazing, and kind of informs a lot of the work that I do. I wanted to show you this video as well. This is a video that I made with scientists as part of the making of a film, where basically we start with a butterfly from kind of, aerial shot, and we zoom in to the atomic scale. And you can kind of see the specific structures, and then you kind of zoom back out. And this was an installation that I did for an exhibit where basically, and this is part of the work that I've done, but as you kind of go into the magnification of the butterfly wing, you start hearing people speaking at the border. So I'm mixing kind of immigration policy and the Dreamers Act and the DACA repeal, and all of this is kind of embedded in. I'll just show you a little bit of the. So anyway, so kind of playing with these things, and these are all short films that I made, kind of leading up to making the feature film, and also thinking, as a symbol for immigration and borders. The butterfly has been used as a symbol for migrant rights. People have been using the monarch butterfly, saying like, we also are like monarch butterflies. We have the right to migrate, and migration is a human right. And I think that was something that informed a lot of the filmmaking that I did. And these are some of the stills of my own movie. Actually, this scene didn't even end up in the film, but it was a march that we did for the movie. And another aspect, and kind of I'm gonna end on these things, is also having debates of science on screen. And I have a debate in the film which is about CRISPR and people talking about the ethics of CRISPR and about genetic technology and what does it mean to to modify our genes and who should be able to do that. And so I love having these debates on screen and in films because I think it informs a lot of the science that we think about. And again, this is a monarch butterfly. This is just showing you a butterfly that without getting too much involved, there's like a mutation in a gene that creates fuzzy borders between like the colors get a little messed up on one of the sides. And so I thought that was interesting to think about borders not only on the wing, but also thinking about borders between countries, also thinking about borders between forestation and deforestation, and making the analogy between the micro world and the macro world. And so just in that vein, this is a little bit of these Venn diagrams that I do when I make films. I think about science, and I think also about rituals, about the micro and the macro, and how to connect all of these worlds together in the films that I make. And kind of comparing the two worlds in the movie in Mexico and in New York City. So yeah, and some of the themes of the film is that it's a film that's bilingual. It's about immigrant scientists. It's about thinking of identity at the micro and the macro level. It's about impact of new technologies such as CRISPR on our societies, about the intersection of science, religion, and ritual, and also about activism through science. These are all things that are really important in the films that I make. Thinking about the analogies between the border of a wing, and thinking about how that can actually kind of reflect borders in landscapes. And so I like kind of creating these analogies between these two worlds. So this is a little bit of the work that I do. I'm going to end with a little video of the Science New Wave, kind of recapping a little bit of those traits. And then I'll open it up to questions. But if anybody wants to reach out to me, here's my email. And of course, my website is my name, alexigambis.com. But I'll show you this small video, and then we can open it up to questions. So there we go. If anybody has any questions, I went a little over there, but yeah. Don't be shy.
I have a question.
Of course, go ahead, Jay.
So when you first started doing this, did you think you were thinking about this in a vacuum, or did you think you had a cohort of other people who were also thinking about these issues? Because we feel like here in Woods Hole that we were thinking about it, not necessarily in a vacuum, but it wasn't really something that was a big issue in either film or science. But I think that has changed.
Yeah, I think my experience is that when I was a PhD student, when I was doing research, I realized that there was a lot of people that that were frustrated by how science was being depicted in the media, and were also frustrated by how they were being either being stereotyped or being, that there was kind of like a gap that they didn't fully understand how to rectify. So I definitely felt that there was a community of people that wanted to kind of create kind of this change. So obviously, the work that I did was, most of it was kind of motivated by scientists who wanted to be active players in how their work was being, advertised, or also thinking a little bit about their own lives. I remember when I was a scientist, a lot of people would tell me, "Oh, you don't strike me as being a scientist," or there were all of these like very strange kind of depictions about scientists. So I think in my case, definitely I felt that there was almost like a Dead Poet Society, like a little circle of people that came together and wanted to be part of it. And I still feel that today, because in the work that I do with the festival, every time we organize the festival, all of these people come together, and there's like a huge excitement around not only showing the work, but also always thinking about the form, redefining, how do we make better stories about what we do? How do we kind of change the landscape in these types of things? So I think now what's changing is that there are many organizations that are realizing that this is important. So I think there's maybe more of like, it's maybe less underground. It's becoming a little bit more kind of formalized, which is great, which is what should be happening. And of course, there are many foundations like the Sloan Foundation and Simon's Foundation that are helping kind of provide opportunities for people to work in this intersection. So,
John, can we bring Mary Chochos up front?
Cool.
Or there's Glenn too. Maybe Glenn first.
Can you hear me?
We can hear you, yeah.
Oh, okay. So sorry, I thought I was waiting for my video or something. But I can turn it. I see. Okay. How you doing?
There we go.
I love your. I don't know how much of a question I have, but I love this whole. Can you hear me?
Yeah, I can hear you.
Yes.
Great.
Okay. I love your whole approach, and I think it's a great idea to do this, because scientists have been vilified so much, and there's so much misinformation and such a lack of critical thinking. And there are some instances like Independence Day where they do make a scientist a hero, which is nice. But then mostly, more often than not, they're villains, or they're connected to big pharma or something like that. So this is incredibly important. I'm glad to see that there's such a organization. I'll definitely try to connect as I'm learning how to write now for the first time, even though I've been doing it for 30 years. I finally found a teacher who can actually teach me how to write. So I'll look forward to joining it someday in the future.
Yeah, Glenn, I will add also that what's interesting is that a lot of the work that also this idea that bringing science into film is not necessarily mainstream, that it's still considered to be kind of in that in order for it to be mainstream, you have to kind of bend the truth, or you have to create these villains. I think that's also something that's becoming a bit of a myth, because there's many ways of kind of engaging people, and also, under quotation marks, being commercial in the work that you do, whether it be episodic TV work, even like shows like Breaking Bad, for example, are wonderful shows that get into some of the science as well. And I think we're seeing more of that you can be factual and kind of pay tribute to the scientists, but at the same time, you can also be somewhat mainstream as well. So I look forward to seeing your scripts. Yeah.
The storytelling, what's so lacking from the storytelling is how unbelievably heroic the scientific community is, and how it seems like the mass population doesn't realize how incredibly important. I mean, I don't know if do you know the name Dr. Needleman?
Yeah, I've heard of it. Yeah,
he's the one who fought to get lead taken out of paint, and despite all the powers that were he fought for years and years and years. And obviously the scientists that fought against the tobacco industry. It's like people don't understand how important it is to our survival that scientists are. So I think it's great what you guys are doing.
Yeah, and oftentimes what happens is that a lot of the anecdotal, a lot of the stories behind some of these scientists, they're stripped away, and people don't oftentimes think about, the lives of these scientists. And I think more and more we're seeing amazing biopics and amazing stories that are being told. But it's also important as a postdoc, in today's world, and what are they doing, and how, why did they get interested in the work that they did? But yeah, look forward to reading your scripts, Glenn.
Great. And there have been some amazing docs in this festival of young people getting excited about science, which is really positive for the future. Every time I can catch those docs that just show all the young people getting involved in science, it's so exciting.
Yeah.
We actually have 2 premiering tonight that we made through the Film and Science Initiative. So then Mary Chochos, she had her hand up in the chat. She's not able to come on because you can't hear her, so I'll read her question. Are there funding opportunities for science-focused films?
Yeah, there are. There's more and more of those. I mean, there are 2 types of many film. Well, there's two routes, right? There are film festivals, and there's different types of organizations that support festivals that are basically celebrating or harvesting films that are science films. For example, the Sloan Foundation gives a lot of support to Sundance. There's commissioning grants. The San Francisco Festival also gives out script and development program or script and development funding for early films. The Tribeca Film Festival used to do that. So this is a Sloan Foundation that sort of attaches itself to other festivals and provides support, especially for science in fiction, in kind of in narrative filmmaking. But now there's the Simons Foundation, Science Sandbox, that has also been very key in supporting work that's hybrid and documentary work. There's Science Sandbox films that are being supported at Sundance and other festivals. So there definitely is. And of course, the Woods Hole has, there's a whole science and film initiative. At Imagine Science, we now have a Science New Wave lab where we're giving out support to films as well that are feature films. So yes, there is. And I would also say that that in the research world, there's a lot of ways of getting grants as well, science grants, whether it's NSF or NIH. It's a little bit trickier, but there are ways. I should mention that a lot of the way in which I raise money for my own films is through the sciences. Actually, I get a lot of grants from the sciences. I don't get much of my money from the film world. I get it mostly from the scientific, research that are interested in science communication or science outreach. And of course, because I'm a biologist and I talk about the importance of communicating science, there's a few grants that are available to me for that. So I think those are very U.S. centric. There are many other organizations that help. I mean, there's also the World Wildlife Fund, that could be potentially helpful in terms of, if you make films that have specific topics about, animal endangerment or animal conservation. So there are ways, and actually, film funding is already so hard to begin with that science could be a way in which you could actually get more support. And there's also a lot of investors, a lot of philanthropists that are interested in supporting, even big foundations, corporate foundations like AT&T and Amazon and all of these others. There's a huge interest in science communication, the Melinda and Bill Gates Foundation as well. It's trickier with fiction sometimes because I think a lot of the grants are oftentimes given to, not everybody understands the importance always of science in fiction, but I think it's changing more. But maybe science documentaries seems to be a little bit more, grants seem to be more accessible for those. But the Sloan Foundation is a great example of science in fiction. So the answer is there's more and more of these for sure. And whether it's actual funding or networking or residencies, there's a lot happening. And of course, Woods Hole is doing a lot of that as well. So.
The next question is on the screen.
How do you know a scientific concept idea has a place in one of your films? Or this thing? Xavier, yeah. So it's an interesting question. A lot of my work starts with animals. I'm interested in kind of animals as metaphors for human. I think a lot of my work is often visually based. So if I can think of the research as something that is visually grabbing, for example, like the development of a butterfly wing, that kind of gives me material to work with when I actually develop my films. I'm obviously, a lot of my work is in the biological field. So biology, evolutionary biology is something that I'm particularly interested in. But there has to be, to your point, there has to be a connection between the science with spirituality, but also with like a personal story. I usually have to meet a scientist that I can kind of shadow and sort of use them as a stepping platform to develop my own characters. And if I don't find that scientist, then I have a hard time. If I don't embody the science in a human being, then I have a hard time making films about that research. That's a really good question. I think that, there are many ways of doing that. One is I would literally reach out to scientists, because you would be surprised to how many of them actually want to be engaged in filmmaking. I would also reach out to young scientists or working scientists, not necessarily principal investigators, but PhD students and postdocs, and just present yourself and say like, oh, I came across your research and I would be interested in collaborating. And you'd be surprised to see how many of them would be keen on collaborating. The other place is, film festivals, like mine, and of course the Woods Hole Film Festival is going to events where, there's like scientists and filmmakers meeting together and engaging in things. It doesn't always have to be film festivals. It can be art science events. There's the World Science Festival in New York. There's panel discussions. There's many events across the US where scientists are speaking. Like for example, like cafes scientifiques, basically like science talks in cafes and bars. All of these environments are usually prone to meeting people that are interested in the intersection of science and arts. But I would say, I would email scientists and just kind of introduce yourself and say like, would you be interested in collaborating? But it's a good question, and we're trying with my platform and with the festival to find ways where we can facilitate those interactions, whether it's online. We're trying to create almost like a LinkedIn platform where scientists and filmmakers can collaborate, or whether it's at the festival. I know that it's sometimes tricky to make those encounters, but if there's a specific field that you're interested in, I would start researching and finding. Again, it's always about finding the people and just reaching out to them. That's what I do also when I start working. I just email scientists and I say like, do you have an hour to speak to me about your work and about your life as well and how you got interested in what you do?
I just want to add one thing to that. When we started making these two films that we're premiering tonight, we worked with scientists who actually wanted their stories told in film. So they're both documentaries style. Yeah. But, we've been working with them for 3 years. And they're giving their time unpaid too. And that is one thing that I think people don't necessarily take into account when they're approaching scientists, which is that they're already super busy. And so budgets generally don't provide funding for that, but that's something to maybe think about from like NSF or those other kind of grants.
I don't know. To that point, Judy, I think one of the things is always to if you approach a scientist as a filmmaker, make sure that it's collaboration, that you're helping each other. So there may be something that the scientist wants to film or something that they want to communicate. And so as long as there's an understanding that you're working on this together, I think that's with any type of artistic endeavor, the collaborative aspect is critical. And I think with science, oftentimes you oftentimes see like people saying like, oh, I want to come to your lab and I just want you to speak about what you do and then I'm going to leave and I just want you to give me like a 1-minute spiel about what you do. I think it's really important to understand that it's a collaboration between between two people or two or more people, and I think that's how you have to approach those encounters and those requests. That's always a very tricky. There's a lot of filmmakers. There's a filmmaker that I think is doing interesting work. I don't always love it, but I think it's definitely playing with the form. This filmmaker's name is Mike Cahill. He did Another Earth and also this film called Eye Origins. Eye Origins is such a fascinating movie because it's about how the eye, like the development of the eye, but it's also kind of this love story and about somebody that loses his girlfriend and then tries to find her eyes in the world. And it's also talking about how we study the eye in labs, and it's definitely he made also this film Another Earth about kind of us living in these kind of parallel worlds, and I think Mike Cahill is really great. I love Gattaca. Gattaca is a film that I kind of come back to, but there's also I'm very fascinated and interested in kind of early French New Wave cinema. Science. So there's a French filmmaker, his name is Alain René. He did a film called My American Uncle, where he speaks about fear conditioning in rats, and he compares that to human beings. And so a lot of my inspiration comes from that. And there's a beautiful Spanish film that I love called Spirit of the Beehive. And it's a film about this little girl that starts seeing her father as Frankenstein after watching it in a movie theater, in like a traveling movie theater in Spain in the 1950s, and her father's a beekeeper, and she starts imagining her father as a beekeeper and as Frankenstein, and I would consider that to be a science film. So my definition of a science film is quite broad, but the new ones, I think Christopher Nolan as well does some interesting work, especially Memento and these types of films. Definitely played with. Inception was a film that I also enjoyed quite a bit, and so I would consider his work to also be quite interesting in exploring scientific ideas and also kind of philosophical ideas. I think that's all we got. But if anybody has any more questions or to reach out to me, I'm around. So if you want to kind of just email me or connect, on social media or whatnot, I'm around. And hopefully you can get, if you haven't seen my movie yet, hopefully you'll be able to see it.
Actually, there's one question in the chat. Sorry.
Oh, there is.
And then we'll wrap it up after that. But it says regarding, it's at the very bottom if you see it. Or I can read it. Whatever is easiest.
Oh, I have it. I'm not able to see it.
Okay, it says, great film. Regarding the very visual dream sequences, can you talk a little about how you approach developing those?
Yes. So so a lot of the, for example, when a lot of the work that I do in terms of magical realism or thinking about how to play with science fiction, I usually incorporate that into the dreams of scientists. So I don't necessarily go into science fiction, but if scientists have dreams, that's where I can play as a filmmaker with bending a little bit the form and kind of getting a little bit visual. One of those, so there's different ways in which I come up with kind of the dream sequences. One of them is either by speaking to scientists and asking them, have you had any dreams? I usually ask this when I interview scientists. I ask them, like, what is one of the craziest things you've thought of? And scientists would be, they once thought that they would actually inject the pigment into their skin, the butterfly pigment. So I kind of use the fantasies and the stories of the scientists to then kind of create my own visual allegory with that. And then the dream sequence of the butterflies, part of that was done with the actor, but I also wanted to play with this idea that the butterflies represented a way of escaping water and this idea of flooding. And so I had this idea of kind of covering him with butterflies. The other inspiration was some early paintings from like Frida Kahlo and Diego Rivera, where I saw some paintings where people were covered with butterflies, basically. Especially during the Day of the Dead, you know, people wear costumes where they're literally living inside kind of like almost like a uniform of butterflies. So I use a lot of kind of the Mexican traditions and allegory, and I obviously, you know, use my own kind of visual language to do that. The one where the scientist touches the window and it becomes a butterfly wing, I used real imagery from a scientist that actually is one of Patel's postdocs, and he gave me that butterfly wing, and then I just basically mapped it onto the window. So it's kind of science fiction, but with real butterfly imagery. And I love dreams, because I feel like dreams is where I can have fun with kind of bending a little bit the scientific facts and playing with the reverie and the dreams. Yeah.
Well, I just want to say thank you so much. This was so interesting. And the good news
Thank
is
you, everyone. Yeah.
that Alexi will be back with us on Thursday at 4 p.m. For a panel discussion with Nipam Patel, who's the director of the MBL, and Josh Seftel, who's the director of Bruce and Alvin that we're showing tonight, and Beth Murphy, who's the director of Wildfire, which is the first episode of a 10-part series that we're doing on the intersection of youth climate activists and scientists. And so I really hope that you'll come back for that. It's also virtual on Thursday. We also hope that next year this will all be happening in person. And we really hope that some of the scientists who we are so interested in working with will figure out how to deal with COVID in a way that makes that possible. But I think, you know, the takeaway is this is really inspiring for everybody. Thank you so much. And it's actually very hopeful. It's very hopeful. So it's great.
Yeah, it's I almost call it like renaissance. There's like a renaissance in science and film, and I think hopefully one of the positive aspects of COVID is I think there's going to be a lot more awareness that science is not niche. You know, there's nothing niche about it. It's part of our everyday lives, and there's an urgency to tell stories about science and scientists. And yeah, we'll talk more about it on Thursday with Nipam. Nipam is an inspiration to me, and you know, you're very lucky to have him in Woods Hole, because I consider him to be one of the best like avant-garde filmmakers, like visual filmmakers, and you know, he's also obviously an amazing evolutionary biologist. So.
Yeah, and we'll hear about the amazing stuff that they're doing with imagery at the MBL and at the Woods Hole Oceanographic Institution. So we are very lucky to be at the epicenter of a lot of this. So thanks, everybody. We'll say goodbye and have a wonderful day.
This is my little like spiel. Yeah, everybody. Bye-bye.
Thank you.